examine this problem. And this is where we left off, was this slide last week. Respect of person, lifting one man, literally lifting one man's face above another, looking with favor upon another's countenance, receiving the faces, literally. But we understand what respect of persons means. This is where we close. Pyramid climbers are in politics, they're in industry, they're in society, and unfortunately, sometimes they're even in the church. I got frustrated even in a secular job. You see it in the secular world, how people just, trying to get ahead. And that's not always an inherently bad thing, trying to better oneself. But you know what we talk about? We talk about pyramid climbers, those who are willing to walk all over anybody to try to, quote, get to the top. And to see that spill over into the church is really shameful. And so James is going to deal with that in this section, and he does, again, this is one of those sections where he's not going to mince words. I mean, he says very plainly, very clearly, this is wrong, it's sinful, and God does not put up with it. Some verses here, this is kind of where we left off last week. I want to pick up looking at some particular verses on this. Now I lost control of my remote. Click on that slide for me, Brother Robert. See if it's... Sometimes you have to click on that thing to give the remote. There we go. Okay. Luke 20:21. They say of Jesus, we know that what you say and teach is right, and that you don't regard or accept the person of any, but you teach the way of God truly. This was understood of Jesus. They said, we know, you don't play favorites. You're not choosy with who you're going to listen to, who you're going to rub elbows with, we sometimes say. You don't have respect of persons. And so that's an example for us that we see in the life of Jesus. Deuteronomy 1:17, the old law taught them, ye shall not respect persons in judgment. Micah, we just studied that on Wednesday nights. Micah and really other of the minor prophets are going to come down very hard on this because they began doing that. They would have respect of persons in judgment. Romans 2:11, as many as have sinned without law or outside the law of Moses particularly, shall also perish outside the law, and as many have sinned within the confines of the law shall be judged by the law. No respect of persons with God. Ephesians 6:9, you masters do the same things unto them, talking about how they deal with their servants. It'd be more like an employee-employer relationship today. Knowing that your master also is in heaven, neither is there respect of persons with him. Colossians 3:25, last part of that verse, no respect of persons. Acts 10:34 and 35, Peter comes to Cornelius and his household, and he says, of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. Over and over again the Bible emphasizes this. So James is saying, don't try to be a Christian and end up being a hypocrite at the same time. While you're being a hypocrite while you claim to be a Christian, but you're having respect to persons. It goes on. If there come under your assembly a man with a gold ring and goodly apparel, and there come in also a poor man in vile raiment, they're becoming prone, or apparently are prone, to judge by a person's past rather than by his future or even by his present. Outward appearance rather than inner attitude of hearts, what he's dealing with here, they're judging by that. Synagogue, this is the word assembly is literally, we have it many times in the New Testament translated synagogue, and it doesn't always mean literally the synagogue, it's just synagogue in the Greek language, but sometimes it just means this, assembly. So it's coming into your assembly place, and sometimes people say, well, where in the New Testament, especially sometimes you have the discussion with somebody about Bible authority, and they'll say, well, the New Testament never talks about church buildings. Well, here it just talks about assembly, and you see this sometimes in the New Testament. Well, assembly implies a place to assemble. And it may not have to be a church building. It may be in someone's home, and we know that they did that oftentimes in the New Testament, but they didn't always do that. Sometimes they would assemble in other places. Sometimes they were able even to use a synagogue, at least for a time. Usually that was limited because eventually the Jews would kick them out of the synagogue because they were preaching and teaching Jesus. But just oftentimes translate assembly. You just have to look at the context to determine which is the right translation. But here it's clearly assembly. So if somebody comes into your assembly, we would say, in our situation, somebody comes into your worship service or your Bible study class or gospel meeting, wherever the church is assembled together. And the sad thing is that no place is safe from temptation. And we sometimes think we're coming to worship and we get away, and in a very real sense we do. But there's no place where Satan is not going to try to reach us. And you see that. Sometimes you deal with, sometimes churches and particularly elderships have to deal with immodesty in worship. And I've seen situations where there was one congregation that the elders actually published an article in the bulletin and said, for some of the ladies said, we need your help. And it got to be a problem where some of the men were actually refusing to serve the Lord's Supper because of some of what was being worn, and it was presenting a stumbling block. And it just shows, no place is safe. And sometimes you have a situation where congregations, or again, more particularly elderships, have to deal with a lot of discord within a congregation. Again, that's obviously something that you would think you'd get away from. We just talked about pyramid climbers, those trying to get to the top, so as they would view it, by any means necessary. You wouldn't think that'd be a problem in the church, but sometimes it is. Gossip, backbiting, things like that you just think, okay, I can come to worship and I'll get away from all that. And most of the time I think that is the case, but not always. In fact, sometimes when we let down our guard the most, well, we're the most vulnerable. But no place that we get away completely from Satan, because he's going to try to reach us wherever we are. This is a passage in James 2 dealing with judging. This would be the wrong kind of judging. Of course, John 7:24, Jesus is going to clarify the how of judgment. Judge righteous judgment. Don't judge according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Matthew 7, the textbook passage that everybody likes to use and say, don't you judge me. That's a passage that it does say, judge not that you be not judged, but the problem is people stop right there with verse 1. And he goes on, he says, here's how you need to judge. He's condemning hypocritical judgment, but then he goes on and says, you need to, you know them by their fruits. And so as one fellow said, I forget who it was an old-timey preacher that used to say, I'm not judging, I'm just fruit inspecting. And that's what Jesus talks about. By their fruits you'll know them. So judgment's not wrong. It's unrighteous judgments, particularly hypocritical judgment. That's the worst kind, is when I'm sitting here with the same problem and I would dare to condemn someone else. He goes on, he talks about a gold-ringed man wearing them in an ostentatious fashion. That's from the Gospel Advocate Commentary. Great wealth is implied by that. And interestingly, people would back then, and people will do this now even, they'll rent some kind of fancy jewelry or something to reflect social standing, whether they actually have that standing or not. Sometimes people will do that now. They may rent a limo, they may rent a really fancy car or a really fancy outfit or jewelry or something just to try to look like something that really we're not. I heard a guy say one time, he was not talking about renting in particular, he was talking about buying things. He said, we buy all these things because we want to go impress people that we really don't even like that much. And sometimes that's the case. But here's the guy, he's trying to look rich whether he is or not. And he may very well be. It may be his ring. But, this is just showing you that sometimes they would do that in that society. Of course, goodly apparel, we understand what that's talking about. Brilliant. In their society, be usually very vividly colored garments. And it would be in stark contrast to the others who are arriving. I think there's something to be said here, and I'm like Brother Wilkes when we took Fishers of Men in Dalton, Georgia, at the Highland congregation. Brother Wilkes he had this expression where he'd say, sometimes I get put in the position of defending something that I don't like. And that's how I feel sometimes when the subject of dressing for worship comes up, and people say, well, you ought to wear your very best. And I agree with that. But I also think about passages like this. You think about this, if you're in a situation in a congregation where there are people and they're all farmers, and the best they've got is, their Sunday best bib overalls or whatever. And I come in wearing a suit. How does that appear? It makes me stand out. Then I become the immodest one, because that's what immodesty is. It's drawing undue attention to yourself. So I think yes, we ought to give our best to God in worship, but we need to qualify that, because here's a situation where James says, if you got a congregation of a bunch of poor people, and here comes the guy, and he knows that. Now, we've all been in situations where I walked into a congregation one time, and I felt like the most conspicuous thing, because I didn't know. I just, you think you get up on Sunday, you're gonna go to worship, you're gonna put on, I've always, just especially since preaching school, it's just kind of been ground in me, or I at least put on a shirt and tie. So I walk in this place with a suit, and it's just a very country congregation, and I just felt like, I'm sticking out like a sore thumb here. But I didn't know it. Here's a situation where they know, and if you know that, and then you come in, he says, we need to be careful about that. So here comes a guy in, and he's got his nice clothing on. And I will say the time when I did that in the congregation where I was very much overdressed compared to everybody else, I didn't get treated any differently. And I was thankful for that. Those people, they were just as kind to the folks, wearing who the best they had was, what we might say is not very good clothing. But they were just as kind and Christ-like toward them as they were to anybody else wearing nicer clothing. But this is a familiar situation, because this happens sometimes in our day and age. So here comes in a poor man now. So you got the man in your assembly with the nice jewelry. He's got the nice suit on, or the nice clothing. And then here comes a beggarly type person, maybe even dependent upon others for their livelihood. I don't think that's necessarily the case. It may just be somebody who's poor. They don't have as much. Vile raiment. Maybe it's dirty. Maybe it's cheap. Maybe it's smelly in some situations. My home congregation, I remember very well, this little old man, and I don't know how old he was, but I'd say he had to be at least 80. And that poor fella, I guess he lived by himself. I'm thinking he was a widower, but he wasn't able to take care of himself as much as cleanliness and things like that. And he didn't smell the best, but that man, he was there, and he would sit on his spot. And you always knew where he was going to be. Gospel meeting, Sunday morning Bible class, Sunday evening worship, Wednesday night. If he was able, if that spot was empty, something is wrong with him, because he's going to be there if he's able. He never came looking, somebody say, boy, you look sharp today, as far as the world goes. But he was there, and he wanted to be there with the brethren. So, and I don't recall, thankfully, the congregation ever treating him like any kind of less of a Christian or less of a person because of that. And that's the way it needs to be. Brother Paul saying in this slide here shows, kind of the comparison, the Skid Row bum as opposed to the millionaire, the homeless, vagabond, smelly, maybe filthy person, versus the person with the sports car, the nice clothes, the jewelry. And we know the type, the beggarly type folks, and as opposed to the guy who's got the nice car, and some guy maybe even so wealthy he's got him a helicopter. And I don't know that it necessarily even, we sometimes think of it in those extremes, but I think many times this is on a smaller scale, and we ought to be thinking congregationally and individually, examining ourselves on a smaller level and say, okay, what if it's just somebody who comes in and they're not in the nicest clothes? They don't have as nice a clothing as so-and-so or so-and-so. How do we treat that person differently? Do we treat them differently because we view this one as having money and that one is not, this one is having status and that one is not? That's what he's dealing with here. And we sometimes take it to an extreme where here's a guy with a Lamborghini versus here's a guy who's homeless. But it doesn't necessarily have to be those extremes. It may be somebody who just has, more earthly possessions, more earthly means financially versus somebody who doesn't. Having respect to the person that wears the gay or the happy or the nice clothing, paying special attention to is the idea of that word, having respect, gazing with favor on, being impressed by. This word's only used one more time in the New Testament, and I think it's in Luke chapter 1. I can't remember exactly the verse. Sit thou here in a good place. Well, the rich are going to receive this honor treatment among these brethren that James is writing because they're not doing this the right way. So come to the most favored place in the building, and we're going to escort you and make sure you sit in the nicest place. And that's what happens sometimes, or happens sometimes in their assemblies. When you're talking in the synagogue, the most coveted place to a Jew would be near the end of the building, which would face Jerusalem, where the ark in which the sacred roll of the law was kept. So that's where they would want to sit. But you find the best seats, and Jesus talked about this, as you recall. Don't go for the best seats. Those Pharisees, they love to have the best seat. And you can almost just hear a Pharisee, saying, that this happened in a congregation where I was, and it's been several years ago. But we get so wedded sometimes to our seat, right? And I don't know what that is, but when I was in school, I don't know, I liked mixing it up. We'd move around, and sometimes the teacher I guess she'd get bored, and she'd say, okay, we're going to move our desks around today. And some classes you didn't even have an assigned seat, just wherever you want to sit. And we'd kind of gravitate to the same spot, but then, maybe halfway through the semester, you're bored with that, and so you're going to go sit somewhere else. Or maybe you get in a fight with that friend or something, But something about church. We just park somewhere, don't we? And that's not always a good thing. In a way, it could be a good thing, I suppose, because there are certain people, I look and I say, hey, where's so-and-so? Because I looked for the spot and the spot's empty. And some of you like to throw curveballs because I'll say, in fact, Robert threw me one the other day. I leaned over to Reagan and I said, Miss Cheryl's sick today. Is she not feeling well? And she said, no, she's here. And I said, no, she's not. I mean, they sit right in front of us. And she said, look up there. So there's Robert and Cheryl sitting up here. But we tend to get that same spot. But I was at a congregation one time where I was working as the associate minister. And there was a lady there that she was probably fit the description of what James is talking about here. She didn't have the means of this world and things like that. And she didn't come to worship and Bible study like she ought to have. So it was great to see her come into the assembly. She came in, she sat down, and do you know, one of the little old ladies went right up to her just a few minutes later, walked right in, and she said, you are in my seat. She said it. So you know what the lady did? She got up and she walked out of the building. I don't know if she ever came back. Now, that's not right. That's no excuse. Jesus didn't do that to me, so why would I try to punish my Lord for something that, one of his children is not acting right's doing? That's like, one of my kids going up and socking the other one, and they come and say, Mom, Dad, I want to move out. It's just silly. But at the same time, I can understand being quite embarrassed, upset. I might have even been tempted to say, well, really, I didn't realize there were assigned seats here. But, sometimes we do that, and that's nothing wrong with sitting in the same spot, I suppose. I think there's some very useful things about moving around, getting to talk to different people, maybe getting to know different people better because you're sitting closer to them, things like that. I know that's hard to do sometimes because we get in that spot and we tend to stay there, and I'm the same way. But God help us never to get to the point where I would come to somebody and say, you're in my seat, as if I own that spot, and you're going to be subject to me, and I'm telling you to move. That is silly, and it's sinful. And to my knowledge, I don't know that ever really got dealt with in that congregation, and that's a situation where I think if I am an elder of the Lord's church, I'm going to, not in an ugly way, but I'm going to take that sister and I'm going to talk to her and I'm going to say, what you did was wrong. And you need to make that right. You need to contact that lady. Because she was a member. She just wasn't a real strong, faithful member. And I'd say, what, you need to contact her and you need to apologize and make this right. That should have been handled by the leadership, and I don't know that it ever was. I'm not saying it wasn't because I don't know. Sometimes we don't always know what the elders are doing when we're not around. But same deal here. Find this guy comes in, and you can almost just see here's a fellow that maybe, he's kind of on the fringe, and so we're just, he's sitting in that spot. That's good enough. But then here comes, so-and-so, and say, oh, no, you get on out of the way. We want him to sit right here in this great spot. It's respect of persons. It's just as old as time, pretty much, because people have done this for years, thousands of years. But he says, you say to the poor, push them aside, get them out of the way. You stand thou there, or sit here under my footstool. I tell you what, you just have a spot on the floor, buddy. It's kind of the idea. Again, we don't need to explain this. We know. He's told to stand, not going to escort him. Just tell him to stand there. A veiled attempt in this word about the footstool, under the stall where people usually place their feet. It is really a term of subjection and degradation. You're just degrading this person. As you're elevating this one person without cause, just because he's wearing something nice, you think, you have to wonder, he doesn't specifically mention it here, but I think there's probably a lot of this that goes to money. Maybe they're thinking, well, here's somebody who clearly has money, and give us some money. You see this a lot of times. This is one of the things that's unfortunate about our Christian colleges. Some of the bigger brotherhood works is that sometimes they start looking the other way on certain things that are really not right. But they say, but, brother so-and-so is a big contributor, and he wants to see this happen. There was a guy, when I was at GBN, a brother who was willing to give GBN about $1.5 million, I believe it was. That was the buy-in for Charter. Charter, a lot of cable networks they call it a buy-in. And they'll say for 50 cents per subscriber, you can be on Charter. And that sounds pretty good until you realize there's 5 million subscribers. And it wasn't 50 cents, obviously, but I don't know what that math comes out to, but it was about $1.5 million, I believe. Might have been $2 million. But they say once you buy in, once you get your GBN channel on Charter, you're there. So GBN would have been there and parked and have a regular channel, so anybody that had Charter, all over the country would have been on GBN. They'd have had access to GBN. But I can't remember exactly what the brother wanted, but he wanted to change something with the organization of GBN. Instead of it being under an eldership, he wanted some other, and I think he wanted to be one of the head honchos of it. What several of the guys kept saying was GBN is doing evangelism. That's the work of the church. It's doing edification, building up Christians, evangelism, trying to reach out to those that are lost. That's the work of the church. That needs to be under an eldership. No, I want to see this, and he said, well, be a shame for y'all not to get that Charter buy-in. Well, that's tempting if you're somebody and you want to see the gospel spread, you want to see a major outlet like that. But thankfully, Barry Sr. and the elders at Highland, they said, we're not going to compromise on this. And so he took his money and he went elsewhere. In fact, I think he went and found another brother that would do what he said. But that's what happens sometimes. We cater to what we view the higher up in society. And you look at the history, you look at the ministry of Jesus, who did he go to? Time after time after time. He didn't go to those who were the highest on the social ladder. He went to what we would view many times as the lowest. I mean, his disciples, his own apostles come up one day, and you can almost just see them stop dead in their tracks and go, he's sitting there talking to a Samaritan woman. What are we going to do? John says, sometimes it's interesting how, and that's inspiration for you. Sometimes the Bible will say so little, but there's so much packed into that. And the Bible just says in John 4 that, nobody dared ask him what he's doing. That's really about all it says. And I'm paraphrasing that. But what's contained in that is, you can just see them stopping, and they're just kind of gawking. What is he doing? He's just sitting there having a conversation with this Samaritan woman. And they all want to go say, stop. Don't you know who she is? But, it's Jesus. And so there's, what are we going to do? So they kind of just wait it out and see what's going to happen. But they learned a lesson there. Over and over again, Jesus is going to what society would consider the lowest. Some of the ones that these brethren would have nothing to do with. Some of the very ones that these brethren will be saying, you get over there, out of the way, while we escort brother so-and-so to the best seat. And James says it's sinful. Causes of prejudice, it may be background. You see that many times, even today. It may be misunderstandings. Sometimes people are prejudiced, and we could talk about this racially, ethnically, religiously. We could talk about it social status in terms of that. Sometimes it's a misunderstanding, and that happens quite a bit. Sometimes, many times, it's pride. People are prejudiced just because of pride. It may be indoctrination. That often happens, and that goes right with background, by the way. It may be fear. Sometimes it's being afraid, and that especially with money. Again, sometimes these, whether it's the president of a university or something like that, they're afraid, if I don't please so-and-so, if I don't elevate him, he's going to take his money and go elsewhere. Well, he might, but that's, whether he does or doesn't, that's no reason to treat him differently. Bad experiences sometimes lead to prejudice. I may have a bad experience at a restaurant and decide that every single restaurant by that name is bad. Well, that's prejudice on a smaller scale. Sometimes people have a bad experience with a particular church, and they decide that they're all like that. Now, that can go either way. I've seen people that had a bad experience with a congregation of the Lord's people, and suddenly they decide every Church of Christ is bad, and whatever experience they had with that church. But sometimes we can pigeonhole other people into beliefs that they don't have, and that's why I tell people, when you teach a class or when you study denominational doctrines, you have to be very careful. I think it's better to look at the false doctrine rather than to say, here is X denomination and here's what they teach. Because you mark it down, there'll be somebody in that denomination that'll say, that's not what we teach. And now you've misrepresented them. And that is upsetting to many people, and that will lead sometimes to prejudice that we're talking about. So you got to be careful with that. I sometimes say, here are a lot of people that teach this, or maybe my experience with these folks is, and I had a friend in preaching school, a close friend, that he came out of the Baptist denomination. And he told me one time, he said, it used to make me very angry that people would say, here's what the Baptists teach, and then he'd go on and fill in the blank. And he'd say, there were several times when that's just not what we taught. In fact, he said, I had an uncle, I think it was his uncle, he said, that taught very plainly, very bluntly, and would even argue with some other Baptists that baptism is for the remission of sins. And he said, that's what he teaches, that's what he believes. He said, he's wrong with some other things and that I'm studying with him, and I hope maybe I can reach him on. But he said, when people get up and say, Baptists teach that baptism is not necessary for the remission of sins, he said, it upsets my uncle, because he says, no, that's not what I teach. So you got to be careful, and some of that leads to prejudice, bad experience. Hasty reactions sometimes lead to prejudice. Sometimes you just need to hear somebody out instead of jumping to that conclusion. Satan and sin, of course, our enemy, they're responsible many times for prejudice. Blindness, figuratively speaking. Ignorance. How often is ignorance the cause of prejudice in any realm? I would say that's probably the number one cause, ignorance. And that's the cause of so many things. That's why Hosea said, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Respect of persons is wrong because it's inconsistent with the Christian faith and the glory of Christ, because it stems from evil thinking. It's contrary to the scheme of redemption, dishonors the person who's created in the image of God. It violates the law of love. It is a withholding of mercy. It causes a person to be a hypocrite. Respect of persons is sin. That's the bottom line. And we need to realize that. We need to be on guard against it. We need to watch out for it, whether it's somebody higher up treating them special or somebody lower down the social ladder treating them less. We need to be on guard against that because it's just not right. And James does not hesitate to make that clear. He goes on and says, are you not then partial in yourselves if you're showing this respect to person? You're becoming judges of evil thoughts. They profess one thing but practice another. Double-minded, he talked about that in chapter 1, verse 8. He says, you're evil-thinking judges. They're judging according to appearance. And God said, the Lord looks on the heart, 1 Samuel 16:7. This is not an honest, this is not a compassionate judge. Whoops, I thought I had embedded fonts here, but I guess that Greek font didn't get embedded or something happened. But it's krine is the noun. Here's what I was trying to put on there for partial judges. I'm sorry, krine. This is a person who decides, one who decides according to equality and common sense, but they're partial judges. A judge is supposed to be impartial. That's what he's called on to do. But they're fawning all over the rich and treating the poor folks with contempt. So James is going to tell them the truth and help them. And so again, you see this expression, hearken my beloved brethren. He said pretty clear terms here. You are showing respect to persons. What you're doing is not right. Now he says, listen. I told you about John Shannon. He'd say, let me take my glasses off and smile. So I'm not mad at you. That's kind of what James is saying here. He's saying, I'm not mad, but I want you to understand this. I'm telling you these things because I love you and I want to see you do what's right. So he says, hearken, gets their attention. Now he's going to address them very lovingly. He gives 3 reasons for accepting the materially poor. He says, here's 3 reasons why you ought not to be doing this, why you ought to be accepting those who are poor in this world's goods, just the same as someone who's rich. Number 1, hath not God chosen the poor of this world? That doesn't mean that there's any inherent righteousness in being poor. And sometimes people talk about the rich young ruler, and Jesus told him to go sell everything and give it to the poor, and he'd have treasure in heaven and come follow me. That's what that man needed. He's not saying that it's always wrong to have riches. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, not money itself. But you do need to be very, very careful if you're blessed with this world's goods, because it can be a stumbling block. And for many folks, it is. I've even seen people. I saw a deacon in the church one time who got promoted at work and was really getting extra responsibility, and as a result of that got a lot of pay, a lot of extra pay. And suddenly, you could just watch this person change. He became more worldly, and suddenly he's taking clients out. And then, then another member of the church goes to work for him and says, hey, I was really disturbed. We took a client out, and Brother so-and-so was sitting at the table, and he starts having a drink of alcohol with the guy. And, here's a guy who's a deacon in the church. And you just kind of watch this guy drift away because he's getting more and more affluent worldly in the worldly sense. But Jesus says, or James says, hath not God chosen the poor of this world? Again, nothing inherently righteous about being poor. In fact, there are some poor folks that are just as vile and ungodly folks as you can imagine. There's nothing that magically makes you righteous because of being poor, but there's no doubt that those many times are the ones who are more likely to receive the gospel because they understand, I need the Lord. I need hope beyond this life. Sometimes wealth will deceive us into thinking, I'm doing pretty well. I've made myself a pretty good life. And that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He walks into the palace one day in Daniel chapter 4, and he says, boy, isn't this a great kingdom I've built for myself? Isn't this a great palace I've built for myself? And God says, you didn't do that, Nebuchadnezzar. I did that. So sometimes we get deceived by riches. Number 2, the poor of this world, rich in faith. Many times you can be poor in this world's goods, but very wealthy in faith. And of course, the opposite sometimes can be true. You can be very wealthy in this world and very dirt poor, as we would say, in faith. What God wants is, if you're poor in this world, be rich in faith. If you're rich in this world, still be rich in faith. God says that's got to come first. Faith. Being what God would have us to be. And if I can be a faithful Christian and make good money and do well for myself, then that's fine. I need to, I want to help the church and help others however I can, but there's nothing inherently wrong with being wealthy. He's just saying you got to use that right. You got to be rich in faith. That's got to come first. Is it sinful to be rich? We just talked about this some. Nothing wrong with making money. The danger is the love of money. We just talked about that. Those who make money their God, of course, are one day going to perish with it. The rich are charged in 1 Timothy 6:17-19 to trust in God. right where he says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, he says charge them that are rich. He doesn't say, Timothy, charge them that are rich to get rid of it all because they can't go to heaven with money. He says, charge them that are rich to put their trust in God. Maybe you can help somebody who's in need as an individual. Maybe you can give some of that to the church and help the work of the church to go forward. But he says, don't put your trust in those riches, just hoarding it up and making that become your God. But he says there's nothing inherently wrong with being wealthy. Those who mind earthly things are the enemies of the cross. Paul talks about that in Philippians 3. And, of course, we're to lay up treasures in heaven. And that's where whether I'm wealthy, whether I'm poor, whether I'm somewhere in between, I can give to the church, I can help individuals in some way or another, and I can lay up treasures in heaven. So it's not just, we're not just talking finances because there's giving of our time, giving of ourselves, but it also certainly involves finances as well. It's possible to be poor in this world, rich in the next. It's possible to be rich in this world and poor in the next. It's possible to be poor in both worlds. And it's possible to be rich in both worlds. And that's why I say there's nothing inherently righteous about being wealthy or poor. So you can be rich in both worlds, though. But I can also know that even though I may never make $1 million in this lifetime, I can still go to heaven. And I can still be counted a faithful child of God and one day hear him say, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. So let's come back to James 2:5. Lord willing, well, next week's our gospel meeting. Wow, it's already upon us, isn't it? Is that right, Jimmy? Next week, right? It just doesn't seem like it's time already. So next week we'll have Brother Blair. He'll teach our Bible class hour. So Lord willing, 2 weeks we'll pick up with these thoughts of James talking about dealing with their prejudice and their partiality that they're showing. Any other questions, comments, anything? I don't think to do that sometimes. Y'all just got to jump in there, if you got something to say. I don't always think to stop long enough, hardly to take a breath. Thanks very much. We'll have a little break before we do worship.